I'm delighted to welcome two outsiders for the first time, Martin Iles. Martin is the head of the Australian Christian Lobby, a position which he took over last year from Lyle Shelton, who was a regular guest here on Outsiders. Martin has also been described as the face behind Israel Folau. Welcome to Outsiders, Martin Iles.
Thank you, Rowan. Thank you, folks.
Good to have you here, mate. Now, how are you enjoying the job?
Oh, it's pretty
Quiet
intense.
times, not much happening?
Well, that's right. I mean, lots of spare time on my hands. I'm just sort of twiddling my thumbs and waiting to come on Outsiders.
Excellent. So, look, there's lots we need to talk about. Abortion, religious freedom, and, of course, Israel Folau and George Pell, if you're up for that as well. But let's kick off with the Religious Freedom Bill, which is coming up or not coming up. Give us your thoughts on the ACL's position on what should be in there and what probably won't be in there.
Oh, look, I mean, I wish it wasn't a Religious Discrimination Act. I mean, I don't think we need more discrimination acts. We've got so many. They're pitting Australians against each other. They're an excuse to give human rights commissioners and anti-discrimination commissioners across the country a lot of power, a lot of money, and to push their agendas. And I wish it wasn't. It is. And so what we'd like to see is a Religious Discrimination Act that has some extras in it that make it useful.
Such as?
Well, for example, you could have in there clear protections for employees outside of their work life. So the Israel Folau type cases to say, look, what they believe and what they say in pursuit of their religion or that's consistent with their religion, their employer cannot act against.
But isn't that protected in the Constitution already? Is that something that we need more legislation that could be, like you said, hijacked and just bringing more people before tribunals who shouldn't be there?
Well, it should be protected in the Constitution, Section 116, but back in the, I don't know, it was like 1917 or something, I think there's a constitutional law professor who says, look, it was strangled at birth, that section. The High Court came out and said, well, you know, that section doesn't apply except in very specific circumstances. So it does very, very little. And I think a better approach would be, and maybe this is something the government consider into the future, is a religious freedom restoration kind of situation where they say, look, Section 116 has been completely strangled. How about we pass a law now that restores what Section 116 intended to give the Australian people in terms of their freedoms? I think that'd be better. I'm much more a freedom guy, much less a discrimination guy.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the problem is we're piling anti-discrimination rules on top of each other, and then you've got a hierarchy of, well, who's being anti-discriminated, you know, discriminated against the most. It's a recipe for lawyers to get very wealthy, but not much else. But also, tell us, you know, what's... One of the problems that we often hear is if you bring in laws that make freedom of religion very open for Christians and Jews, does that open the door to, for example, Sharia law, or does that not matter anyway? If the democracy votes for it, they vote for it.
Look, I think you can, if we enforce the laws that we have, then you do create a great protection against things like Sharia. The problem we got is you've got, you know, Centrelink and groups like this just turning a blind eye to a lot of the practices taking place, say, in Islamic communities and so on, with polygamous arrangements by default and all this kind of stuff. And the law is not being enforced.
Right.
And I remember when the faith-based schools thing came through and they were going to take away, you know, faith-based schools' rights to proclaim their faith, people said to me, well, you know, why don't you start advocating for Muslim schools? Why aren't they getting involved? Well, everyone's too scared to enforce the law against a Muslim school. And that's just the way that it is. There's a protected entity out there. And so there's absolutely no doubt that we can enforce the law to prevent that from being a huge problem, but the reality is...
Political correctness. There you go.
Right.
But then again, though, I mean, like, you talk about Muslim schools, but I would assume that, you know, from your point of view as being a socially conservative lobby group, there would be a lot of points of overlap between what Christian schools would want to teach and what Muslim schools would want to teach in their schools, and that you'd have a lot of common interest and common ground there. So perhaps getting worried about Sharia law is possibly a distraction from some other things that you would want to be working on together.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is one of the interesting things. I've been thinking lately of the Israel Folau thing, of that abortion rally in Martin Place, of this issue. And the reality is that, you know, there are people, the antagonists against Christianity and religion, don't realise that their belief in diversity and unity and multiculturalism basically creates a great constituency of people that are opposed to them on all these social issues.
Because, I mean, we saw this with the last election, too, where a lot of, you know, conservative ethnic groups voted
against Labor.
very much against Labor when Labor thought diversity would bring them into power.
And also, you go to Martin Place the other night for the anti-abortion rally. I mean, who was there? It was ethnic groups all over the place. Probably 70% of them were Lebanese Catholics.
Well, this is fascinating because we've got a little grab of Gladys Berejiklian talking to Ben Fordham on 2GB yesterday, on Friday, and the whole issue. Let's put the politics to one side for a second. It's clearly a huge disaster for the Liberals. They've made a huge mistake rushing into the kind of lovey territory. But let's look at the ethical or religious implications. But just have a listen to Gladys Berejiklian talking about the abortion bill.
You didn't want your faith or your personal beliefs to flow over into everyone else's views, but for the record, your own personal view, not your parliamentary view or your premier view.
My personal view is I'm a very conservative person who would not feel comfortable in having that process. But that is just me, and it's not fair for me. And that's why, and Ben, you've been naughty in pushing me to say that, because I don't want anyone to feel guilty about decisions they've made, because I'm not in their shoes. It is deeply emotional, but everybody has their own reason for voting the way they did. And I want to assure you of this. People might have comments about it being rushed. People might have comments about having different views. But I can tell you that every single member of Parliament, irrespective of how they voted, took the issue seriously, did some soul searching. I know colleagues who said they couldn't sleep at night thinking about how they were voting.
So, Martin, Gladys claims that they took it all very seriously, but have a look at this. This is the moment the bill passed. These are the people who supposedly agonised in their conscience about whether to murder babies or not. Have a look the moment the bill was passed.
The result of the division is 59 ayes, 31 noes. I declare the motion passed and the bill passed.
So, sorry, Martin, I found it quite frankly sickening that you have people cheering and going like it's a birthday party or something or other when you're talking about killing unborn children. Gladys Berejiklian proclaims that she's conservative and this is a terrifying issue for her. To what extent have conservative people had to agonise over this issue? Do you think it's right that politicians have this so-called conscience vote when questionably
that's why I reacted to that clip. I'm pro-choice and I'm sitting between two people who are not. But on the one hand, she says it's a conscience vote, but she voted against her own conscience. She said, personally, I mean, how does that make any sense?
How does that work, Martin?
Look, I think she's trying to squirm her way around the issue. I mean, she's like, oh, I agonised about this. Well, the reality is she put it in the hands of Alex Greenwich, of all people, let him do his thing, sort of hid in her office and wasn't on the floor in the vote, was overseas when the whole thing kicked off. I mean, and then she sits there and says, oh, no, look, I've agonised about this. It's a very serious issue. What rubbish. She's actually saying this now because she's realised that she miscalculated. She couldn't get it through in one day without debate, which is exactly what she wanted to do. She couldn't get it through when she was quietly hiding away, and she couldn't just make it happen, without scrutiny.
Now, you guys commissioned a poll. YouGov Galaxy ran the poll, and it brought back results precisely as we expected. Same sort of results you see in similar polls in the US, where the majority of people, even those who are pro-choice like me, are against late-term abortions. And when they talk about late-term, we're talking 22 weeks onwards. How do you think they're going to handle that? Because this allows abortion past 22 weeks.
Well, the poll also found that 28% of coalition voters said that if they had known about this bill at the time of the election, it would have affected their vote. Actually, they would have voted differently.
Even a bigger percentage of national voters.
Exactly. It's 30-odd% of national voters. And in some key seats, like John Barilaro's seat, it was much higher yet again. I think this is the problem. And you see the agony of these people cheering as the bill passes. Here's the issue. When you see that they had just voted down an amendment that would have said something like, one of the amendments was, look, if a baby is born alive and it should be rendered medical care, not left to die, because that's happened 304 times in the state of Victoria in a 5-year period. They voted that down.
Exactly.
I mean, this is cruelty. It's wrong.
Rita, I just want to pick you up on something. You keep saying I'm pro-choice. As I've said repeatedly on this program, I am pro-choice and pro-life, and I think most people are. I think it's a false dichotomy to say that you're either pro-choice or pro-life. Most people believe women should have a choice in the early stages, and most people believe the baby's interests come paramount in the latter stages.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So you're both pro-life and pro-choice, and this is where I think the debate has gone off the rails by this kind of siloing of people. But back to where do we go from here in this issue, Martin?
Look, I think the trouble is that Gladys has now fallen into the politics on this, which is that she thinks this is a test of her leadership. And so she has to push the bill through because otherwise she'll look weak and the sharks will be circling. And she's got all blinkered in the politics. And I'm sitting here saying, no, look, for goodness sakes...
What do you make of Barnaby Joyce's intervention?
Oh, well, I welcome it, 100%. I mean, Barnaby Joyce has had a rough run lately and you know, he's kind of redeeming himself in my eyes by coming out and speaking on this.
But, you know, people are mocking Barnaby a lot, saying he's the last person you take family planning advice from.
Ooh,
but
he
has been consistent, hasn't he?
Has.
You can't call him a hypocrite because he obviously
there was no abortion in that situation.
And it would have been a lot easier on his life if he had gone down that path.
Well, and he stood by Vicky, and I think that, you know, on this, you know, you simply cannot criticise the man for this.
He lost his job. He's, you know, halved his income, lost his family.
I wouldn't take marriage advice from him, but I would take advice on this issue. So,
Niall, so good to have you on Outsiders for the first time. We'll do it again. Hope you've enjoyed it, and keep up the great work. And we'll chat Israel Folau because you are the face behind Israel Folau, but we'll leave that for another time.